But we're going to send the goat off into the wilderness. And before we do that, we need a pasuk, we need a verse. And it's from the parish of Acharei Maut. It's the 16th chapter of Vayikra. V'nasa hasair alav et kol avonotam. The goat shall carry on him all of their sins. El eretz gezerah, to a land which is gezerah. Gazara means to cut. Somehow this goat is going to a cut off place. Some desert is some place which is cut off from, I don't know, human contact. It's taking the sins somewhere else. Veshilach et hasair bamidbar, and he shall send the goat away in the desert. So we need to get the goat to this cut off place, and maybe we'll sort of think in the next few minutes as to what that cut off really means. And to start off with, we need to get the goat out of the city. And some people, I mean, maybe this would happen today. Some people wanted to get in the way. So they had to build a ramp. They built a ramp, essentially, like the ramp running up to the altar. This is a ramp running from the Temple Mount out to the wall of the city. And we learned in Mishnah Shkalim, in the tractate Shkalim, that public funds may be used for this ramp. And the Mishnah explains, V'chevesh asulo mipnei habavliim. They made a ramp for it or for him. It's not quite clear. Is it a ramp for the person taking or a ramp for the goat? We're not quite sure. And I've alluded to that ambiguity in the source sheet. Maybe they made the ramp for him or for it. They made a ramp because of the Babylonians who'd pull his hair. And the commentators suggest this is pulling the hair of the person that was taking the goat. Although, again, it might be pulling the hair of the goat. But I'm translated here as hair out following Kahati. V'omrim, and they're saying to him, Tol vatsei, take it and go, take it and go. People are desperate to get this goat out of the city. And they're basically shouting at the guy, taking it away and pulling at him in order to get him out of the city. And so in order that he can get out calmly and safely, they make this ramp. And by the way, the Gemara in Yoma says, look, they weren't Babylonians. The Gemara in Yoma, and I put it on your source sheet below, says, Rabbi Baba Chana said, Lo Bavalim hayu, they weren't Babylonians. Hayu Ela Alexandrim, they were Alexandrians. Umitoch shesonim et abavlim hayu korin otan al shemon. And because they hate Babylonians, they call them by their name, but they weren't Babylonians, they were Alexandrians. Anyway, one way or the other, they built this ramp in order to safeguard the goat and the goat's minder as they were leaving the city. And this was an important part of the day. And the Mishnah continues, Miyakirei Yerushalayim, some of the dear people, some of the notable people in Jerusalem. So some of the city elders, some of the important people in Jerusalem would accompany him. That is, accompany the goat and the person leading the goat until the first booth. Ad Sukkah Harishona. Till the first Sukkah, the first booth. Eser Sukkot Mirushalayim v'Tzuk. There were 10 booths from Jerusalem to Tzuk. Now, Tzuk is the place we're going to. Tzuk is in the middle of the Eretz Gezerah, the cut-off land. So, Eser Sukkot Mirushalayim v'Tzuk. Tishim Ris, that means that's 90 Ris. Shiva umechza lechol mil. So there were 10 booths between Jerusalem and Tzuk. And Tzuk is where the goat is going. So what is going on here in terms of the distance? Well, look, we've learned in the Mishnah that there are 7.5 ris. Sorry about the typo. Ris, not ris. 7.5 ris to a mil. And the Mishnah says there were 90 ris in total. So that must be 12 mil. 12 mil to get to this cut-off land. Mil, by the way, must be cognate. with the English word mile must come from Latin or must come through the Latin. Because it is about a mile, actually. A mil is about 2,000 amot, which is about 1,000. It's about a kilometer, actually. It's about a kilometer. So we've got these 10 sukkot, and each sukkah is 1 mil apart. So if we think about the two end sukkot, there are 9 mil. Those 10 sukkot cover 9 mil. And the first one is a mil outside the city of Jerusalem. So that's 9 plus 1, that's 10. And there are 2 mil at the end. So that's a total of 12 mil to the cut-off land. Why are there 2 mil at the end? Well, you probably noticed that a mil is 2,000 amot, and that is the Shabbat walking distance. So people can walk from booth to booth without breaking the tchum, so to speak. They must set up their Shabbat station there before Yom Kippur begins. So they go to the booth, or they set up their Shabbat station at the booth before Yom Kippur begins, and then they can walk from one booth to the other booth. But there are 2 mil, there are 4,000 amot from the last booth to the end, because it has to be a cut-off place. It has to be a place outside the Shabbat walking distance. So right at the end, we have 4,000 amot. Right at the end, he has to go on his own. And here we're gonna read about it in the Mishnah. Al kol sukkah v'sukkah. Al kol sukkah v'sukkah. V'sukkah omrim lo. At every booth, they'd say to him, Hare mazon v'hare maim. Here's food and here's water. This guy is walking basically 12 kilometers in the desert, in the heat. And he has to do it. And the Bet Din permit him to eat and to drink. Actually, they permit him to walk outside the Shabbat tchum. He's going to walk 12 mil. They permit him to eat and to drink. So they put food and water at each sukkah, at each booth. Al kol sukkah v'sukkah omrim lo hare mazon v'hare maim. Here's food and here's water. Umulavin oto misukkah lesukkah. And they accompany him from booth to booth. So someone goes with him, or a group of them go from one booth to the other booth. Chutz me achrona shebahen, except for the last one. She'eino mageh imo latzuk, because they don't go with him all the way to tzuk. They don't go all the way to tzuk, and tzuk is going to be 4,000 amot. They can't go without breaking the Shabbat tchum. And tzuk is a cut-off place that he has to go there on his own. So what do? Eila omed merachok vero'eh et ha'ma'asav. So they stand from afar and they see what he does. So the last booth, effectively, is the last man station, and then he goes on his own. And the Gemara comments, by the way, this is in Yoma, and this is a saying in the Gemara, which we're going to come back to when we learn the 8th chapter of Yoma. Remember, the Mishnah said, Al kol sukkah v'sukkah omrim lo hare mazon v'hare maim. At each booth, they'd say to him, here's food and here's water. And the Gemara says, Me'olam lo hutzrach adam lechach. No one ever needed this. So there are 10 feeding stations on the journey out of Jerusalem to Tzuk, 10 stations for the person with the goat to stop and refresh himself. And the Gemara says, no one ever actually took advantage of those. So why do they need them? So if no one needs to feed, no one ever took from the feeding station, why do they need them? So the Gemara goes on, Eila she'eino d'mo misha yesh lo pat b'salo lemisha ein lo pat b'salo. You can't compare someone who's got bread in his basket to someone who doesn't have bread in his basket. You can't compare someone who knows where he can get his next meal to the insecurity, the terror, the fear of someone who doesn't know where his next meal's coming from. This question of security and transience is the question we're going to address in the 8th chapter of Yoma. And so it's very interesting that the Gemara is going to bring this saying now before we get on to the 8th chapter, just with reference to the emissary of the Bet Din who's carrying who's escorting the goat. And as if to say, as long as he knows that he can drink, as long as he knows that he could drink if he wanted to, then he doesn't need to drink. Yeah. As long as he knows that there is drink available, he doesn't need to drink. That's effectively what the Gemara is saying. And the Yerushalmi has a couple of other stories that give the same idea. Okay. So what does he do when he gets to Tzuk? Me haya'oseh. What does he do? Cholek lashon shel zhorit. He divides, or he divides up the crimson strip. Chetzio kashar basela vechetzio kashar ben shtei karnav. He ties half of this crimson strip to the rock, and half of it he ties back on the horns of the goat. Remember, the high priest, when he drew the lots, originally tied the crimson band to the horns of the goat. So the emissary is now going to effectively untie it from the horns, cut it in two, keep half tied on a rock, and retie the other half back on the goat. What's he going to do next? Udchafo la'achorav, and he pushes it backwards. Vehumi galgel v'yored, and the goat kind of rolls over and falls. Velo hayam agir chatzi hahar ad shena'asa evarim. And before he's got halfway down the slope, he's pushing it off this mountain. Before he's got halfway down, it's just a mass of sort of dead limbs. Then he goes back and he sits under the last sukkah. So he actually goes back 4,000 amot. He's allowed to go back and rest in the sukkah ad shetechshach, until it gets dark. So once it's really dark, he can go back to the city. He could, in principle, go back to the city, but he doesn't need to. He can sit under the sukkah. It's not dangerous to sit under the sukkah. The Gemara considers it to be dangerous for him to stay out in the desert. So that's why, if you like, it's a question of pikuach nefesh. Bad things happen to people who stay out in the desert. So he's got, if you like, a heter to go out and sit under the last booth. What's the crimson cloth for? Well, the crimson cord for? Well, remember, we have a tradition that the crimson cord turns white. And he needs to know, of course, when he's done his job. So what can he do? Well, if he leaves the crimson cord on the goat, then maybe he can't see it after the goat's been pushed off the cliff. Maybe the goat will fall on its head and cover the cord. If he keeps the crimson cord with him, maybe it'll turn white before the goat's pushed, and he'll be so excited he'll forget to push the goat off. So the Gemara explains he rips it into two. Half he keeps with him and half he keeps on the goat. And the cord should turn white once the sins have been forgiven. And there's another, we'll learn when we learn the next Mishnah, there's a similar cord in the temple in Jerusalem. And then the Mishnah asks, Umi eimatai matameh v'gadav. We've got another pasuk from the parsha of Acharemot, ve'hamashalech et ha'sa'ir la'azazel, someone who sends the goat to Azazel, yichabes b'gadav ve'rachatze b'saro b'mayim. He shall wash his clothes and wash his flesh in water. Ve'acharechein yavo el hamachane. After that, he comes in the camp. He's unclean until he's washed. So the Mishnah asks, ume'imatay matameh v'gadav v'gadim. From when are his clothes unclean? Mi sheyetzeh chutz l'choma Yerushalayim. As soon as he leaves the gate, the wall of Jerusalem. That's the main opinion of the Mishnah, because at that point he becomes hamashalech. He becomes the emissary. And Rabbi Shimon is going to disagree. Rabbi Shimon says, Rabbi Shimon Omer Mishat D'chiato latzuk. Rabbi Shimon says, no, he doesn't become the emissary until he actually throws the goat off. And the halacha does not go according to Rabbi Shimon. As soon as he leaves the city walls, we consider him to be the emissary, and at that point, his clothes become tameh. Very interesting. It's a paradox, just like the red heifer. The person that effectively cleanses the whole people of Israel ends up with his clothes being tameh. So it's a paradoxical situation. It's a reversal of roles. The person that's responsible for the cleansing of the people of Israel actually ends up with tumah on his own clothes.